Hey there, welcome back to American Miscellany. It's this big, beautiful collection of essays. So we just finished reading essay number 78, which was the fifth installment of Travels in the Holy Land. Excellent little series there. So we're moving on to page 193 in American Miscellany, published 1865. This is essay number 79, Power of Music. Okay, let's see what we have to learn about power of music. It has been justly said that music had no mortal artist for its inventor. It was implanted in man's nature as a pure and heavenly gift by the great Creator himself. Of all the fine arts, it alone comes home to every heart. The uncultivated rustic who would feel less pleasure in contemplating the Apollo of Belvedere than in gazing at one of the coarse painted plaster of Paris figures hawked through the streets of our cities, and would turn from one of the finest of Titian's paintings to admire some flaring sign over a country inn, is alive to the tones of music, and can feel all his sympathies awakened by a tender or a lively air. Music is so much a part of our nature, surrounds us so completely in this vocal world of ours, that its influence begins at the cradle and only ends at the grave. It has even been conceived to make a part of the enjoyment in a happier state of existence. There is a sweet harmony even in inanimate nature. The measured flow of the waters, the regular rushing of the tide, the wintry gusts sighing through the woods, or the summer breeze rustling the leaves, and the sweet echoes returned from rock to glen, or breathing in melting cadence along the waters, which gives the listener a feeling as if he were admitted to a communion with the unseen world. When we consider the music of the animated world, the singing of birds, the hum of insects, the lowing of cattle, it seems reasonable to ask whether this melody is meant for the delight of man alone. Though his organs may be more delicately adapted for musical sounds, his feelings more exquisitely alive to them, yet we may still believe that the lower creatures participate in some degree in the enjoyment, a belief that may be more readily granted from the innumerable instances on record of the pleasure which music has appeared to give them. We are told that musical sounds have wonderful power over the stag, exciting complacency, if not rapture, and that his enemies frequently employ the shepherd's pipe to lure him to destruction. Mr. Playford mentions that he met a herd of stags consisting of about 20 on the road following a bagpipe and a violin. So long as the instruments were played, the stags went forward. When the music ceased, they stopped. In this way they traveled from Yorkshire to Hampton Court. The excitement of horses and of hounds when they hear the hunter's horn is well known. Stephanus states that he saw a lion leave its prey to listen to music. There is a remarkable instance of the delight which a flock of sheep and some goats took in listening to the flute, mentioned in the Life of Haydn. A party of young people were enjoying themselves one summer's day on the side of a mountain near Lake Maggiore. One of the party took out his flute and began to play. The sheep and goats, which were following each other toward the mountain with their heads bent forward, raised them at the first sound of the flute, and all advanced in haste to the spot from which the music proceeded. By degrees they flocked around the musician and listened in motionless delight. He ceased playing, but the sheep did not stir. The shepherd with his staff obliged those that were nearest to him to go on, but when the flute player began to perform again, the flock returned to him. The shepherd became impatient and began to pelt them with clods to force them to move, but not one of them would stir. The shepherd, enraged with them, whistled, scolded, and finally pelted them with stones. Such as were struck passed on, but those who were not refused to stir. The shepherd had at length to entreat the musician to cease before he could get his flock to move, but whenever he resumed the instrument, they would stop at a distance to listen. It is said by Goldsmith and others that the elephant appears delighted with music, and very readily learns to beat time, to move in measure, and even to join his voice to the sound of the drum and trumpet. Not long since, an officer in the English army mentioned that at Gibraltar the monkeys used to come forward to listen to the military bands, and during the time of their performance would seat themselves on a wall to listen, retiring as soon as the music was over. It is well known that there have been dogs which evinced the greatest pleasure when they have heard music. The story of the dog at Rome, which went by the name of the opera dog, from his regular attendance at the opera, is well authenticated. Many witnessed his raptures, and have seen him, when he could not gain admittance to the theatre, stand with his ear close to the wall to catch the sounds. Some have evidently distinguished airs, testifying more delight at some than others. Mr. Chambers states that his father had a cat, unlike many of her kind, which seem heedless of all music but their own purring, for she evinced the most extraordinary feeling whenever she heard the song of Mary's Dream. It was frequently and most sweetly sung by a gentleman who was sometimes a guest in the house. Poor puss would listen with rapt attention till she heard, "Sweet Mary, weep no more for me," when she became excited to an extraordinary degree, mewing most piteously. Had we believed in the transmigration of souls, we should most assuredly have thought that sweet Mary was again an inhabitant of this world in the shape of a sleek tabby cat. It has been said that even the wild antelope has been known to come out of the woods to listen to music. A party of choristers experienced surprise one evening when they were enjoying themselves on the banks of the Mersey. As they sat upon the grass, they joined in an anthem, and after a while, as they sang, they perceived a hare come from an adjoining wood, and stop within about 20 yards of them, turning her head with evident pleasure of them, turning her head with evident pleasure to catch the sound of the music. When the singing ceased, the hare went back toward the wood. When she had nearly reached it, the singing was resumed. She stopped, turned round, and hurried back to the spot where she had before remained to listen. Here she stayed in evident delight as long as the music continued. When it was over, she walked slowly across the field and disappeared into the wood. In Mexico, it is absolutely required that the swineherd should have a musical voice, that he may sing when the pigs quarrel, which has the effect of soothing them and lulling them to sleep at the proper time, which greatly promotes their fattening. The gushing of the wind and all sounds, it is well known to have a great effect upon these creatures. We lately observed in the streets of New York a number of dogs dancing correctly to some of the most difficult waltzes, to the tunes played by their master. Snakes can be tamed by music. It is said that even when irritated by pain or hunger, they can be soothed by a plaintive air. Sir William Jones heard from one person, on whose veracity he could rely, that he had often seen the most venomous and malignant snakes leave their holes upon hearing tunes upon the flute. It is thus the Indians free the houses which are infested by snakes. The sound of the flute entices them out from their hiding places where they lurk. It is said that when the Negroes search for lizards, which they make use of for food, they attract them by whistling an air. We may almost credit the powers of the lyre of Orpheus when we read of a gentleman confined in the Bastille, who begged the governor to permit him the use of his lute, to soften by the harmonies of his instrument the rigors of his prison. At the end of a few days he was greatly astonished, while playing on his lute, to see peeping out of their holes great numbers of mice, and descending from their woven habitations crowds of spiders, which formed a circle about him, while he continued breathing his soul-subduing instrument. That's what she said. When he ceased to play, the assembly, who did not come down to see his person, but to hear his instrument, immediately broke up. As he had a great dislike to spiders, it was 2 days before he ventured to touch his instrument again. At length, having, for the novelty of his company, overcome his dislike of them, he recommenced his concert, when the assembly was by far more numerous than at first. Thus is this anecdote given in the Curiosities of Literature, and has often been reprinted. It may fairly be credited when we recollect that bees, when flying away, will lag behind if they hear any tingling sound, and their flight, when about to swarm, can be effectually arrested by the sound of a bell, near which they will settle themselves. Bullfinches can be taught to warble an air with the most astonishing precision. Sir William Jones states on good authority that when a celebrated lutenist was playing to a large company in a grove near Shiraz, the nightingales were distinctly seen trying to vie with the musician, sometimes warbling on the trees, sometimes fluttering from branch to branch, as if they wished to approach the instrument, and at length dropping on the ground in a kind of ecstasy, from which they were soon raised by a change in the measure. If music has such charms for the lower creatures, well may its influence be great over the human race, whose sensibilities, fond associations, and tender recollections can be awakened by its witching spell. It indeed mingles itself with all our pursuits. It quiets the child in its cradle, as the nurse sings her soothing lullaby. It rouses the patriot's zeal. It stirs up the spirit to revelry, or raises it to devotion. It exhilarates intercourse, and lightens labor. Sweet is the milkmaid's song as she plies her task. Its cadence falls alike soothingly upon her own ear and upon that of the cow who supplies her pail. There is in the chorus of the yo-ho of the sailor, as he labors in his vocation, that which makes it lighter. Itinerant vendors of goods have set their proffered sale to regular notes, so that the different articles which they carry are known long before the words which accompany the cadence are heard. We were much amused lately when reading letters from a gentleman in the north of Scotland to his friend in London, written before 1730, with an account of the manner in which music accelerated the harvest work. He says, when there are any number of women employed, they all keep time together by several tones of the voice, and stoop and rise together as regularly as a rank of soldiers when they ground their arms. Sometimes they are incited to their work by the sound of a bagpipe, and by either of these things proceed with a great alacrity, it being disgraceful for any one to be out of time with the sickle. They use the same means when thickening the new woven plaiting, which is done by 6 or 8 women sitting upon the ground near some river or rivulet, in 2 opposite ranks, with the wet cloth between them. Their petticoats are tucked up, and with their naked feet they strike one against another's, keeping exact time, as above mentioned, and among numbers of men employed in any work that requires strength and joint labor, as the launching of a boat or the like, they must have the piper to regulate their time. Travelers, in passing through the southern states, must have often remarked the slaves lightening their labors by chanting some simple melody in concert. To keep time seems a natural propensity. Why it should be so may yet be determined by philosophers. It would be beyond our limits to point out one instance in 100 that we could enumerate, but in everything we hear, though it may pass without our observing it, there is a kind of measure, and this often suggests subjects to musical composers. A favorite air imitated the yelping of dogs so exactly that it could not be heard without the resemblance being perceived. One of the most delightful compositions was suggested by the regular strokes of the blacksmith's hammer against the anvil. Sir Charles Bell, in his admirable treatise on the hand, observes, "The divisions of the time in music in some degree depend on the muscular sense. A man will put down his staff in regulated time. In his common walk, the sound of his steps will fall into measure. A boy striking the railing in mere wantonness will do it with a regular succession of blows. This disposition in the muscular frame to put itself into motion with an accordance to time is the source of much that is pleasing in music, and assists the effect of melody. The closest connection is thus established between the employments of the sense of hearing and the exercise of the muscular sense. The effect of disorders of the nervous system is sometimes to show how natural certain combinations of actions are in the exercise of the muscular frame. Sir Charles Bell illustrates this observation by a curious case of a young woman who had never been able to learn a common country dance. Yet, when under the influence of a morbid mental excitement, in association with the organs of voluntary motion, began to exercise involuntary movements not unbecoming an opera dancer. At one time, she would pace slowly round the room as in a minuet with a measured step, the arms carried with elegance. At another time, she would stand on the toes of one foot and beat time with the other. On some occasions, she would strike the fable or whatever she could reach. Maybe they mean table. Or whatever she could reach, with her hand many times, softly, and then with force. At length it was found that she did everything in rhythms. A friend thought that her regular beating in her regular beating he could recognize a tune, and he began singing it. The moment this struck her ears, she turned suddenly to the man, danced directly up to him, and continued to dance until she was quite out of breath. The cure of this young woman was a very unusual kind. A drum and fife were procured, and when a tune corresponding to the rhythm of her movements was played, in whatever part of the room she was, she would dance close up to the drum and continue dancing until she missed the step, when these involuntary motions instantly ceased, and the paroxysm ended. The physician, profiting by this and observing a motion in her lips, put his ear close to her mouth. He thought he could hear her sing, and questioning her, she said there was always a tune dwelling upon her mind, which at times had an irresistible influence upon her, and impelled her to begin her involuntary motions. In the end, she was cured by altering the time in the beating of the drum, for whenever she missed the time, the motions stopped. But should she have been cured? I mean, that sounds like musical genius. Dancing genius. Why would you want to cure that? The nicety of perception for fine sounds in some minds is as remarkable as the extreme enjoyment they derive from them. A musical gentleman mentioned in company that amidst all the noise of a large party he could distinguish the faintest tinkle on a wine-glass, because it was a musical sound. Some years ago, an eminent violinist arrived in Edinburgh and took up his lodgings in a street where all the houses were externally alike. Returning home late one evening and having forgot the number of the house, he was at a loss to find his home till a musical expedient occurred to him. Conceiving that he should be able to distinguish the street door bell of his landlady's house, he deliberately went along the small portion of the street, ringing each bell till he arrived at one of a peculiar tone, which he at once recognized as the right one, and on hearing which he waited till he was admitted. We do not know if the hero of the subsequent anecdote was in any degree gifted as a musician, but his perception of nicety in tone seems to have been as great as that of Signor E. It was in April. I don't know why they do that. Like, why are they censoring Signor E? It's E with a line after it. It was in April 1836 that Lieutenant Layer, on leave of absence from his regiment, spent a night in the Bush Inn in Manchester. In the morning, as he was sitting at breakfast, a band of street musicians came past, and in one of the instruments, the serpent, he thought he recognized the peculiar style of playing of a man who had once performed on that instrument in the band of his regiment, but who had deserted. The lieutenant immediately ran downstairs, found his surmise correct, and had the man apprehended. To those entirely ungifted with music, such delicacies in this particular intellectual sense seem miraculous. Mr. Barrett and other physicians have believed that music affected the whole nervous system, so as not only to give temporary relief in some diseases, but to achieve radical cures in many cases. He thought that music could palliate the pains of the sciatica. He conceived that certain vibrations of the nerves, along with other effects produced, to be the cause of this, and that its power of fixing attention and withdrawing the mind from the feelings which occupied it to different channels of thought and sensibility, awakening dormant sensations, might produce a powerful effect that might operate on the entire frame, causing changes almost miraculous. Theophrastus asserted that diseases have either been cured by music or mitigated. We find this illustrated in Mrs. Grant's Letters from the Mountains, when she mentions the effect which the singing of his attendants had on her little boy in soothing his last sufferings. But, like everything she wrote, it is so interestingly given in her own words that it is best to transcribe the passage. I, for my part, though a stranger to the art of music, am well acquainted with its power, and subject to its influence in the rudest forms, particularly when it breathes the spirit of that sentiment which for the time predominates in my mind, or awakes some tender remembrance with which accident has connected it. When my dearest little boy was in the last stage of that illness which proved fatal to him, we had 3 maids which all had good voices. One was afraid to sit up alone to attend my calls, on which the nursemaid agreed to sit with her, and lull the infant beside her. The solitary maid was then afraid to stay alone in her attic abode. The result was that the 3 sirens sung in concert a great part of the night, which seemed to soothe the dear sufferer so much that when they ceased, he often desired that they would begin again. He listened to it 3 hours before he expired. I never hear the most imperfect note of crochalin, 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 since without feeling my heartstrings accord with it. Sir Henry Halford, in his Essays and Orations, mentions the case of a gentleman who became insane on the loss of his property, and for months was in such a state of stupefaction that he remained perfectly motionless, not moving unless when pushed, nor would he speak to or notice any person. Music in the street at length produced its effect. He was observed to listen, and to be still more awakened to its power the second time he heard it. The person under whose care he was availed himself to this happy omen, and offered him a violin. He seized it eagerly, and constantly amused himself with it. The result was most fortunate. In 2 months he was dismissed cured. Sir Henry alludes distantly, but affectingly, to the case of George III, who had been his patient, and bears testimony to the power which music had over his mind, mitigating the sadness of seclusion. And we have heard a most touching account of the venerable king, sightless and secluded, a prey to visionary delusions, yet finding a sweet solace for his troubled mind in the touches of sweet harmony. There, at his instrument, he might often be seen, wrapped in thought, as the strings responded to his touch in the sacred strains of Handel. One of the most remarkable instances of the efficacy of music occurred during the celebrated Farinelli's visit to Spain. The Queen determined to try the effect of his astonishing powers on the king, who had had a passion for music. He was then laboring under such a dejection of spirits as baffled all medical treatment and disappointed every effort made to divert his thoughts. Neither pleasure nor business could rouse him from the hopeless melancholy under which he labored. Utterly incapable of managing public affairs or of enjoying domestic intercourse, he remained in a state of the most deplorable sadness and apathy. Farinelli was placed in a room adjoining that where the king sat. He sang some of his pathetic songs with all the captivating expression for which he was so remarkable. The queen anxiously watched the effect, nor was she disappointed. The king seemed surprised, and as he listened he became affected, and tears forced their way, and the pent-up feelings gushed forth once more. Another song, and he ordered the attendance of the singer. Farinelli appeared. The king gave utterance to his delight and admiration, and desired him to say how he should reward him for the gratification which his wonderful talents had given. Farinelli, who had been directed how to act, only entreated that his majesty would permit his attendants to dress him, and that he would appear in council as usual. The king complied, his spirits returned, and thus Farinelli effected a cure in some moments, which the ablest medical men in Spain, all the devoted courtiers, all the anxious family, had in vain endeavored to bring about. This affecting anecdote naturally reminds us of the playing of David before Saul, when the evil spirit departed from the king, and he was well. To this very remarkable case, the beautiful lines of Cumberland, now almost forgotten, but worthy of being remembered, are appropriate. The last stanza runs thus: "The turbid passions shall retire before the minstrel's art, and the same hand that sweeps the lyre shall heal the stricken heart." As to Farinelli, he rose to the highest favor at court, and to his great credit, instead of being elated by an elevation so exciting to one of humble birth, he preserved a humility and simplicity which endeared him to the Spanish nobility, and won from them their esteem and confidence. The marvelous anecdotes recounted of this gifted man reflect as much honor on his disposition and character as they do on the genius that so eminently distinguished him. There was such enchantment in his singing that it completely overcame Senesino, who was himself one of the finest singers. He and Farinelli had long wished to hear each other sing. The opportunity was at length afforded, and they were engaged to perform at the same theatre. Senesino played the part of an inexorable tyrant, and Farinelli of his unhappy captive. When he appeared in chains, he sang with such exquisite pathos that Senesino forgot the cruel part he had to sustain, and he forgot everything. And throwing himself into Farinelli's arms, he burst into tears. But this need not surprise us when we recollect that 2 hired assassins, who it may be presumed were not possessed of very tender feelings, when they waited to fulfill their engagement to murder Stradella, near the door of a church in Rome, where he was taking part in an oratorio, were so completely overcome by his pathetic music that they not only abandoned their purpose, but confessed it to him and warned him of his danger. The complete mastery which music often exerts over the mind may be considered its greatest triumph. I need only to allude to the Ranz des Vaches of the Swiss, the Marseillaise of the French, the Lochabert no more of the Scotch regiments, and Hail Columbia of the Americans. Its influence over the affections may be illustrated by an anecdote connected with a custom which is observed among the Greeks. The young Greek often leaves his home for a foreign land, but never without grief. Fondly attached to the place of his birth and to his domestic ties, he feels himself an exile wherever he goes, and endures the greatest anxiety on account of those near and dear to him that he has left, and is often haunted with a sad foreboding that he is to meet them no more. When he is about to take his leave, there is a farewell repast, to which the relations and the friends are invited. When it is over, all the guests accompany the traveler some miles on his journey. During this, and at the repast, it is the custom to sing farewell songs. Many of these have been long in use, but some are composed specially for the occasion, and it not unfrequently happens that they are composed extempore by someone dearest to him, or by himself. There was such a meeting held one day near Pindus, on the occasion of the youngest of 3 sons of respectable parents devoting himself to voluntary exile. The deepest regret which he felt in leaving the home of his childhood was the consciousness that he carried with him no share of the affections of a mother on whom he doted. She, unlike the generality of Greek mothers, had never marked him as an object of her love, but had treated him with a coldness painfully contrasted with her conduct towards her other children. But this he had borne without a murmur. But now that he was about to leave her, perhaps forever, his heart was breaking. The spot chosen for the parting was a wild and desolate scene among the high and rugged rocks. Several of the mournful songs had already been sung, when the young traveler, separating from his company, ascended a rock which overhung the path. Here he sang his last sad farewell in tones that sank into every heart and drew tears from every eye. Is that why they call it a party? Is that why we call them parties nowadays? There were tears, drawing tears from every eye. He expressed with the deepest pathos the passionate grief which he felt in quitting his home and those he loved, but his greatest anguish was in thinking he was going without his mother's affection. The heart of the mother was touched. Her emotion increased with every word and every note of the pathetic air to which he sang. The warm current of affection gushed from its hidden springs. She clasped him in her arms, and weeping and kissing him over and over again, she entreated forgiveness and promised to love and cherish him as long as she lived. The promise was inviolably and tenderly kept. The most simple music, or that which is hardly music at all, often finds its way to the very heart. It is said that Curran attributed his first impressions of eloquence and poetry to the wild chant of the Irish cry, or funeral dirge. The memory of some of these strains, which have been often described as something unearthly and resembling the melody of an Aeolian harp, no doubt flitted across his mind as he had sat preparing himself for the defense of some client's life, as was his wont, with his violin in his hand, from which ever and anon he drew forth wild and plaintive sounds. It is customary with the improvisatori to sweep the chords of an instrument as they compose their verses to aid their conceptions. Even the music of bells produces a powerful effect. Who does not feel his spirit lighten as he hears the merry chime of festive bells? Who does not feel a touch of awe as the death bell tolls? The inhabitants of Limerick are proud of their cathedral bells, and well they may, for they are passing sweet. They boast that they were bought from Italy, and tell of their having occupied the skill of a clever young artist for some years. By the time he had manufactured them, their chime had taken such possession of his heart that he resolved never to leave them, so that when he sold them to the prior of a convent, he removed to their neighborhood, that he might still hear their music. He hoped that they would toll his requiem. Troubles came. He lost his property, the convent was laid waste, the bells were taken away, and this grieved the artist more than any of his losses. He wandered over many of the countries of Europe, hoping to reach the spot where his bells might be. Years after they had been manufactured, it happened that, toward the close of spring, on a lovely evening, a vessel had anchored at some distance from Limerick, and a boat was seen to glide from its side along the Shannon. It had been hired by one of the passengers, the Italian artist, now grown old and gray. He was impatient to reach the city, to which he had traced his much-loved bells. As they rowed along the smooth waters, the steeple of the cathedral appeared in the distance above the surrounding buildings. The boatman pointed it out to the stranger as he sat in the stern. He fixed his eyes earnestly and fondly upon it. The boat glided on, but all at once, through the stillness of the hour, the peal from the sweet cathedral bells burst upon the air. The stranger crossed his arms upon his breast and leant back. The shore was reached. The face of the Italian who still turned toward the cathedral, but the spirit had fled, and the bells had tolled his requiem.